The engine quit at 4:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October of 2014. Dale Withers knew the exact time because he looked at his watch when the Massey Ferguson 7480 lost power and coasted to a stop in the middle of his east field. And the time was the first piece of information his mind reached for, because his mind, in the way that a farmer's mind works during harvest, was constantly calculating time against acres, against weather, against daylight, and the calculation that had been running all day now had a new and unwelcome variable in it. He was 3 miles from finishing. Not 3 miles of road, 3 miles of standing corn, the last field, the northeast corner of his operation, the ground he had saved for last because the terrain there sloped away from the drainage and dried slower than the rest, and he had been waiting since Monday for it to reach the moisture content that would let him cut it without losing too much at the head. He had started that morning at 6. He had been running all day. He had 63 acres left when the engine quit. He climbed down from the cab and stood in the field and listened to the silence that a combine makes when it stops. It is a specific silence, heavy, weighted by the contrast with the noise that had been present for 12 hours. Dale stood in it and did not immediately react, because Dale Withers was a man who did not immediately react to things. He had been farming in Benton County, Indiana for 31 years, and he understood that the first minute after something goes wrong is not the minute for action. It is the minute for assessment. He checked the fuel, full. He checked the gauges, oil pressure, temperature, hydraulic pressure, normal, normal, normal. He tried to restart. Nothing. The engine turned but did not fire. He tried twice more with the same result. He climbed back down and opened the engine access panel on the right side of the machine and looked at what was accessible without tools. He saw nothing immediately obvious. The belts were intact. The hoses were intact. The visible connections were intact. Whatever had failed was inside the engine, which meant it was not something he was going to diagnose or address in a field with the light failing. He stood beside the machine and looked at the 63 acres of standing corn, and then at the sky to the northwest, where a weather system had been building since noon. The forecast had said rain by Saturday. Dale's reading of the sky said Friday evening at the latest, possibly Friday afternoon. The corn in the field was at 18% moisture, borderline, manageable, but not the kind of moisture content that sits well through a rain event without cost. He had a problem. The problem had 3 dimensions: 63 acres of corn that needed to come off, a combine that wasn't running, and rain that was coming before he could get the machine fixed. Dale was 58 years old. He had farmed alone since his son had moved to Chicago in 2008, and his hired man had retired in 2011. He had not replaced the hired man because the operation was sized for one person working hard during the critical periods, and he was still capable of being that person. He had not asked for help in 31 years of farming, because in 31 years of farming he had not needed to ask. He had managed breakdowns in weather and bad years and equipment failures with the specific self-sufficiency of a man who has constructed his life around not being dependent on other people's availability. This was not pride in the way that pride is usually meant. Not vanity, not stubbornness, not the refusal to appear weak. It was something more structural than that. It was the operating philosophy of a man who had decided early that the only dependency he could completely control was dependency on himself, and who had organized his farm and his schedule and his equipment choices around that decision across 31 years. The Massey Ferguson 7480 had been part of that philosophy. He had bought it in 2008 at an estate sale in Warren County, paid cash, driven it home, serviced it himself, and put it to work without a service contract or an extended warranty or any arrangement that required him to involve another party when something needed attention. When it needed attention, he provided the attention himself. When the attention required a part, he sourced the part. When the part required a specialist, he drove the machine to the specialist and waited for it and drove it home. He had managed 11,000 hours of a combine's mechanical life on that basis. 11,000 hours without asking anyone for anything. He stood in the field beside the silent combine for 4 minutes. He had counted them without meaning to. The kind of counting a person does when they are deciding something and the decision requires the full weight of what it means. He was deciding whether to do the thing he had not done in 31 years, whether the combine was the situation that required it. Whether the rain and the 63 acres and the 417 on his watch constituted the specific set of conditions under which the philosophy had to yield to the arithmetic. The arithmetic was unambiguous. He could not fix the combine before the rain came. He could not hire custom combining at this time of day on this timeline. The only option that produced a result in the available window was a neighbor with a machine who said yes. He walked to his truck and drove to his neighbor's farm. The neighbor's name was Frank Aldrich. He was 64 years old and farmed 700 acres adjacent to Dale's operation to the east. They had been neighbors for 22 years. They had spoken at the elevator and the co-op and across the fence line in the way that farmers speak to the people whose ground touches theirs, regularly, briefly, with the specific economy of two people who share a boundary and a context and do not need to explain either. They had helped each other twice before Dale's combine stopped. Once in 2003, when Frank's grain cart had lost a wheel bearing during harvest, and Dale had loaned him his cart for 2 days while the repair was done. Once in 2009, when Dale's planter had needed a row unit replaced at the start of planting, and Frank had his dealer's service truck stop at Dale's farm on its way past to deliver the part. Neither of these had been large favors. Neither of them had been discussed at length afterward. They had happened because the need was present and the help was available, and that was sufficient reason. Dale pulled into Frank's driveway at 4:45. Frank was in his own shed, doing the end-of-day maintenance on his combine, a Massey Ferguson 9790 he had bought used in 2011. He looked up when Dale's truck stopped and came to the shed door. He said, "You're not combining." Dale said, "Broke down. East field, 63 acres left. Engine quit, won't restart. I don't know what it is yet." Frank said, "What do you need?" Dale said, "I don't know if you can help. I need the corn off before Friday evening. If the weather comes in on Saturday, I lose the grade on what's standing." Frank said, "I've got 40 of my own left." Dale said, "I know." Frank said, "But not until Tuesday. I finished the rest this morning." Dale said, "I didn't know that." Frank said, "Come back at 6 tomorrow morning. We'll start on yours." Dale said, Frank said, 6 o'clock. You run the grain cart. I'll run the combine. We'll have it done before the rain. Dale said, "I'll pay you for the machine time." Frank said, "We'll figure that out when it's done." 6 o'clock. Dale stood at the shed door for a moment. He had driven 4.5 miles to ask for something he had not asked for in 31 years, and it had taken Frank Aldrich approximately 45 seconds to say yes. Dale did not know what to do with that in the moment. He said thank you. Frank said he'd see him at 6. Dale drove home. He sat at his kitchen table for a while. He was not a man who kept a journal or wrote things down for any reason other than the operational ones, the maintenance logs, the yield records, the financial ledger. But that evening he wrote a single line in the margin of the harvest notebook he had been keeping since October 1st. October 9th, asked Frank Aldrich for help. He said yes. He closed the notebook and went to bed. Frank Aldrich arrived at Dale's East Field at 5:58 the following morning with his Massey Ferguson 9790 running and his own grain cart hitched to his tractor. Dale was already there with his grain cart. The field was cold and the corn was dry. Not dangerously dry, but the moisture had dropped overnight from 18 to 16.4, which was better than Dale had hoped, and worse than it would be after the rain came. They had not worked together before, not like this, not the shared labor of a single objective pursued across a single day. They had helped each other in the incidental ways that neighboring farmers help each other, briefly and practically, but not in the sustained way that a harvest day requires. What Dale discovered in the first hour was that Frank ran his machine the way Dale ran his own, with the attentiveness of someone who is monitoring multiple variables simultaneously and adjusting continuously, watching the header, watching the grain flow, watching the ground ahead for the places where the terrain changes the machine's behavior. Frank Aldrich was a good operator. This was not a surprise. 22 years of adjacent fence lines had given Dale sufficient evidence of what kind of farmer Frank was. But watching it up close across 12 hours was a different kind of knowing. They worked through the morning without conversation beyond what the work required. Frank ran the combine. Dale ran the cart, pulling alongside at the end of each pass, taking the load and driving to the grain wagon at the field edge, returning for the next pass. The rhythm of the work established itself within the first hour and held through the rest of the day, with the specific efficiency that comes when two people who understand what they are doing work together toward a clear objective. By noon they had 31 acres cut. By 3 in the afternoon, 49. By 5:30, when the light was going and the wind had shifted to the northwest and the smell of the approaching rain was present in the air, Frank made the last pass on the final strip of corn and swung the combine to the field edge and shut it down. 63 acres. Done. Dale stood at the edge of the empty field and looked at the ground that had been standing corn that morning and was now cut stubble, and understood, with the specific and uncomplicated gratitude that arrives when a thing that needed to happen has happened, that the crop was saved. Frank came across the field from the combine. He stopped beside Dale and looked at the field too. Then he looked at the sky, which was doing what the sky had promised it would do since Monday. Frank said 15 minutes. Dale said maybe 20. The rain started 18 minutes later. They were both in their trucks by then, the equipment secured, the grain in the wagons covered. Dale sat in his truck in the field lane with the rain on the windshield and felt something that he did not immediately name, because Dale Withers was not a man who named things he felt while sitting in a truck in a field lane in the rain. He drove home. Frank drove home. Neither of them talked about it that evening. Dale's combine was diagnosed the following week. The fuel injection pump had failed, a component failure, not operator error, the kind of thing that happens to a machine with 11,000 hours on it that has been used hard across 11 harvest seasons. The repair cost $4,200 and took 9 days. The combine was back in Dale's shed by October 20th, the harvest finished, the corn in storage. The rain that came on the evening of October 10th delivered 1.5 inches overnight and left the field Dale and Frank had cut at a moisture that would have cost Dale $2 per bushel in drying charges on everything that had been standing when it hit. 63 acres of corn at an average yield of 192 bushels per acre at $2 per bushel in drying cost was $24,192. That was what Frank Aldrich's yes had been worth in the specific and calculable sense. Dale did not tell Frank this number. He paid Frank for the combine hours at the custom rate that prevailed in Benton County that season. $22 per acre, 63 acres, $1,386, and added $400 for the use of Frank's grain cart. Frank said the grain cart addition was not necessary. Dale said it was. Frank accepted it. The total payment was $1,786. Against the $24,000 the crop would have lost without the help. It was a small number. Dale understood this. He did not say it to Frank. Frank would have told him the accounting was the wrong way to look at it, and Frank would have been right, and Dale knew he would have been right, and so he paid the $1,786 and said thank you again, and Frank said it was nothing, and that was the end of the conversation in its immediate form. But it was not the end of the story in the form that stories take when they travel through farming communities. At the elevator in November, Dale mentioned what had happened to 3 farmers he knew. Not as a story, not as an illustration of anything, but because they had asked why he was running Frank's combine in his east field on a Friday in October, and the honest answer required explaining. He told them the combine had quit and Frank had come, and they had finished before the rain. The 3 farmers asked the same question in different forms. Did you know he would say yes? Dale said he hadn't known. He'd driven to Frank's shed and asked, and Frank had said yes in about 45 seconds. One of the farmers said, "You'd never asked before." Dale said no. The farmer said, 31 years. Dale said, yes. The farmer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what made you drive there instead of calling the dealer? Dale said, the dealer would have come Tuesday. The corn needed to be off by Friday. Frank was the only option that worked. The farmer said, you could have lost the crop. Dale said, I know. The farmer said, but you drove to Frank's. The farmer said, and he said yes. He said yes. The farmer looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that Dale remembered specifically because it was true and because Dale was a man who remembered true things. He said, that's what a farming county is. Two people who've shared a fence line for 22 years. One of them breaks down 3 miles from the finish, and the other one says yes in 45 seconds. That's the whole thing. That's what it is or it isn't. Dale thought about that on the drive home. He thought about 31 years of not asking, and one afternoon of asking, and 45 seconds of yes, and the specific weight of a thing being finished that could have been lost. He thought about what it had cost him to drive to Frank's shed. Not the money. The money was the $1,800 he had paid, and that was a fair price, and he had paid it without complaint. What it had cost him was the 31 years of self-sufficiency that the asking had interrupted. The philosophy that had shaped how he farmed, how he maintained his equipment, how he organized his schedule, how he thought about his place in the county's agricultural community. All of it had been organized around not needing to make that drive. And then he had made the drive, and Frank had said yes in 45 seconds, and the crop had been saved. And the 31 years of self-sufficiency had not been negated by the asking. It had been what made the asking possible. Because Dale Withers had been the kind of neighbor for 31 years who could walk into a shed on a Thursday afternoon and have his request answered in 45 seconds. The self-sufficiency had built the trust that made the yes possible. He had not understood that until the drive home in November. He thought about it for a long time. Then he went inside and added a second line to what he had written in the harvest notebook in October. The 31 years were what made the 45 seconds possible. The Massey Ferguson 7480 was repaired and returned and ran through the following 2 harvest seasons without incident. In 2016, Dale replaced it with a used Massey Ferguson 9790, the same model Frank ran, a coincidence that neither of them planned and both of them noticed. He bought it at an estate sale in Warren County for $68,000 cash and drove it home and put it in the shed and began the pre-delivery inspection that he always performed on a new machine before the first season. Frank came by the following Saturday to see it. He walked around the machine, checked the hours, 4,200, looked at the head, looked at the unloading auger. Then he said, "Good machine. Treat it right." Dale said, "I've been watching how you treat yours." Frank said, "For 22 years." Dale said, 22 years. Frank nodded. He drove home. Dale continued the inspection. In the fall of 2018, Dale's east field yielded 211 bushels per acre, his highest ever on that ground, the result of a tile drainage improvement he had made in 2016 and a planting population adjustment he had made in 2017 based on his own yield mapping. He noted the yield in his harvest records and noted the drainage work that had produced it, and noted, because he noted things that were true, that the drainage work had been possible because the crop had been saved in 2014 and the capital from that crop had funded the tile in 2016. The chain of it, Frank's yes in 45 seconds, 63 acres finished before the rain, $24,000 not lost, drainage tile installed with the proceeds, 211 bushels per acre 4 years later. None of it was planned. All of it was connected. The connection ran back to a Thursday afternoon in October of 2014 when an engine quit 3 miles from the finish. And a man who had not asked for help in 31 years got into his truck and drove 4.5 miles. Dale Withers is 68 years old now. He still farms the same ground in Benton County, though he has reduced his operation since 2020, leasing out 300 acres to a younger farmer and working the remaining ground himself at a pace that his body accepts without argument. The Massey Ferguson 9790 he bought in 2016 has 9,000 hours on it. He maintains it the way he has maintained every machine across 35 years. Oil on schedule, filters when the hours require, nothing deferred that the deferral will cost more than the doing. Frank Aldrich retired in 2019. He sold his operation to his son-in-law and moved to a smaller property outside town. Dale saw him at the elevator the previous fall, the first time in 2 years. They talked for 20 minutes about the crop, the weather, the county's changing agricultural landscape. Before Frank left, Dale said, "I still think about October 2014. Frank said, the rain, and the 45 seconds. Frank looked at him. Then he said, "You'd have done the same." Said, "I'd like to think so." Frank said, "I know so. That's why it only took 45 seconds. I knew who was asking." He drove away. Dale stood in the elevator lot for a while. He thought about 31 years of not asking, and one afternoon of asking, and what Frank had just said, that the 45 seconds had been determined not by the request itself, but by who was making it. That the yes had been possible because of everything that had come before the asking, the 22 years of fence line and elevator conversation, and the small accumulated knowledge of a neighbor's character built from proximity and time. Dale drove home. He noted the conversation in the margin of his current farm journal, beside the page for November 2022. 2 lines, in the same plain handwriting he had used since 1983. Saw Frank at elevator. He said he knew who was asking. That was the 45 seconds. He closed the journal and put it back on the shelf beside all the others. 35 years of seasons, recorded one harvest at a time, the continuous account of a farm and the decisions that had kept it running. The Massey Ferguson was in the shed. The corn was in the bin. The 45 seconds were in the journal. Some things in farming are measured in bushels and dollars and hours. Some things are measured differently. The 45 seconds it took Frank Aldrich to say yes on an October evening when the rain was coming and the corn was standing, that was the kind of measurement that doesn't fit in a yield record or a financial ledger. It fits in a journal margin in 2 lines of plain handwriting beside a November page. Dale had put it there. It would stay there. That was where it belonged.